In November of 1941, a 22-year-old woman was hanged in a Russian apple orchard by German soldiers. Her name would remain unknown for 16 years. Her own mother would light candles for a daughter she believed was still alive in a country she could not name for the rest of her life. This is the story the Soviet Union hid. It is the story Germany tried to erase, and until 1985, almost no one outside a handful of villages west of Moscow had ever heard it. The snow came early to the village of Golovkovo that November. It fell soft and gray over the wooden fences, over the frozen route left by German half-tracks, over the small orchard where the apple trees stood bare and black against a white sky. The war was only 50 miles from Moscow. Now, you could hear the artillery at night, a low rolling sounds like distant thunder, and the villagers had learned to sleep through it the way farmers sleep through storms. But on the morning of November 29th, 1941, they woke to something worse than artillery. A woman had been left hanging in the orchard. She was young. That was the first thing anyone noticed. Her hair was dark and matted with frozen blood. Her uniform, what remained of it, was Soviet. Her boots were gone. Her hands had been bound behind her back with wire, and the wire had cut through the skin down to the bone. She had been beaten. She had been questioned. And when the questioning was finished, the Germans had put a rope around her neck and left her there for the village to find. No one knew her name. For 16 years, no one would. Her name was Vera Voloshyna. She was 22 years old. She had been a student of physical education in Moscow before the war, tall and athletic, with a quick laugh and a talent for gymnastics. In October of 1941, when the Germans were closing on the capital and the government was preparing to evacuate, she had volunteered for a unit that did not officially exist. Reconnaissance and Sabotage Unit 9903. They were partisans in red army uniforms. Young men and young women, most of them barely out of school, sent behind German lines to burn villages the Wehrmacht was using for winter shelter. It was a brutal order, signed by Stalin himself. Deprive the enemy of warmth, force them into the open, let the Russian winter finish what the Red Army had not yet managed to do. The unit sent dozens of small teams behind German lines that autumn. Most of them did not come back. On the night of November 21st, Vera Voloshyna crossed the front line with a small team. The team included another young woman, a girl of 18 named Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya. They walked together through the snow toward the villages of Petryshevo and Yakshino, carrying petrol bottles and a handful of matches. Somewhere in the darkness, the group split. Vera went one way. Zoya went the other. Neither of them came back. Zoya's story would become one of the most famous in the Soviet Union. She was captured, tortured, and hanged in Petryshevo on November 29th, the same day Vera died in Golovkovo, 8 miles away. Photographs of her body in the snow were printed in every Soviet newspaper. She was made a hero of the Soviet Union. Statues were raised. Schools were named after her. Poems were written. Her mother was invited to speak at rallies. Vera Voloshyna was not in any of those photographs. Her body was cut down by a villager and buried without a marker. The Germans did not report her death. The Red Army did not know she had been killed. Her family in Kemerovo received a letter that said only that she was missing in action. For 16 years, her mother lit candles for a daughter she believed might still be alive somewhere, in a camp, in a hospital, in a foreign country she could not name. It was 1957 before a journalist named Georgy Frolov began asking questions in the villages west of Moscow. It was 1957 before an old woman remembered the girl in the orchard. It was 1957 before Vera Voloshyna had a name again. By then, her mother was dead. Here is what the German documents recovered from Wehrmacht archives after 1990 tell us about the last week of Vera Voloshyna's life. She was wounded on November 22nd by machine gun fire during an ambush near Yakshino. She was found in the snow the next morning by a German patrol, unable to walk, bleeding from wounds in her side and shoulder. She was carried to a farmhouse the Wehrmacht was using as a command post. She was interrogated for 6 days. The Germans wanted the location of her unit. They wanted the names of the other saboteurs. They wanted to know where Zoya had gone. Vera Voloshyna told them nothing. We know this because the German officer who signed the execution order noted it in his report. He wrote that the prisoner had proven, and here the word he used is difficult to translate cleanly, uncooperative to a degree that made further questioning pointless. He wrote that she was, in his opinion, a fanatic. He wrote that she sang as they carried her to the apple tree. She was 22 years old. She had grown up in a coal town in Siberia. Her father worked in the mines. Her mother sewed uniforms for the local militia. She had wanted, before the war, to become a coach and train young gymnasts. She had a boyfriend named Yuri who was fighting somewhere in the south. She had never left the Soviet Union. She had never fired a rifle before her training that October. She was, by every measure, an ordinary young woman from an ordinary Russian family. And she said nothing. That is the first thing you must understand about this story. Not the cruelty of what was done to these women. Not the scale of it. Not the machinery of it. Those things will come. But first, understand this. The women who volunteered for the Red Army in 1941 were not extraordinary in the ways history usually measures. They were students. They were farmers' daughters. They were factory workers and telephone operators and medical students. They were, most of them, very young. And when the moment came, they did what a great many trained soldiers on every side of that war did not manage to do. They kept their silence. The Soviet Union was the only nation in the Second World War to send women into combat at scale. Roughly 800,000 of them served in the Red Army between 1941 and 1945. They flew night bombers over German positions in obsolete biplanes, so quiet the crews on the ground called them the Night Witches. They served as snipers, and one of them, Lyudmila Pavlichenko, killed 309 German soldiers before the war ended her career. They drove tanks. They repaired radios under artillery fire. They pulled wounded men out of burning buildings. They were doctors and nurses and machiners and pilots and messengers. And in Vera Voloshyna's case, the saboteurs sent to burn villages behind enemy lines. They were also, from the very first day of the invasion, outside the protection of international law. The Soviet Union had not signed the Geneva Convention of 1929. Stalin had refused, believing correctly, as it turned out, that any agreement Germany signed would be honored only when convenient. And Germany, on the eve of Operation Barbarossa, in the spring of 1941, had drawn its own conclusions from that refusal. On June 6th, weeks before the invasion, the Wehrmacht issued a document that came to be called the Commissar Order. It instructed German soldiers that political officers of the Red Army were not to be treated as prisoners of war. They were to be shot immediately upon capture. 9 days later came the Barbarossa Decree. It went further. It authorized German soldiers to take any measure they thought necessary against Soviet civilians and captured personnel, so with no fear of court-martial or review. It suspended, in effect, the entire legal framework that governed how armies were supposed to behave. Historians would later argue about how many Soviet prisoners died in German hands as a result of these orders. The most careful estimate by the German scholar Christian Streit is 3.3 million. 3 million men and women out of 5.7 million captured. A death rate of 58%. For comparison, the death rate for American and British prisoners in German camps was under 4%. 58%. That is the number you have to hold in your mind as this story unfolds. It is not an abstraction. It is not a statistic. It is a description of what the German army did to the people it captured on the Eastern Front. It killed most of them. It killed them by shooting them and by starving them and by working them to death and by leaving them in open fields through the Russian winter with no food and no shelter and no medical care. And for the women, there was something else. There was a word the Wehrmacht used for them, Flintenweiber. It translates awkwardly into English. Gunwoman, riflewoman. There is no clean equivalent because the word is not clean. It was meant as an insult. It was meant to place these women outside the category of soldier and outside the category of woman and into a third category, a category the Germans had invented for them, a category that carried no protection and no rights and no name in any language but the one their captors spoke. A Flintenweib was not a prisoner of war. She was not a civilian. She was, in the language of German military documents, an anomaly. And anomalies could be handled without paperwork. We will return to that word. We will return to what it meant in practice. But first, I need to tell you about two other women. Because Vera Voloshina died on the first day of this story, and the story is not only about how these women died. It is about how some of them lived, and what they did with the years that were taken from them, and what happened to them in the long silence that followed the war. The first is a woman named Yevgeniya Clem. She was 43 years old in the summer of 1941, which made her old enough to be the mother of most of the women she would eventually lead. She was a history teacher. She lived in Odessa on the Black Sea in an apartment that smelled of books and coffee and the sea salt that came in through the windows in summer. She had been born in Serbia into a family that had moved east during the political upheavals of the Balkans, and she had grown up speaking 4 languages: Serbian, Russian, French, German. That 4th language would matter more than she could have known. When the Germans and Romanians laid siege to Odessa in August of 1941, Yevgeniya Clem was working as a nurse in a Red Army hospital. She had no military training. She had a middle-aged woman's body and a scholar's soft hands and a pair of steel-rimmed reading glasses that she cleaned obsessively with the corner of her apron. When the city fell in October, she was captured with the wounded she had refused to abandon. She was marched east with a column of prisoners toward a transit camp. It was raining. It rained for 4 days. She survived the march. Many of the wounded did not. At the transit camp, the Germans separated the men from the women. The men were sent to a stalag. The women were sent somewhere else. This Yevgeniya Klem, 43, she teacher of history, native of Odessa, mother of no one, disappeared from the records of the Red Army in November of 1941 and did not reappear in them for 18 months. When she did reappear, it would be in the most unlikely place imaginable, and she would be leading a rebellion. The third woman I need you to remember is named Antonina Nikoniforova. She was 34 in 1941, a physician, a specialist in infectious diseases, trained in Leningrad with the quiet, steady manner that surgeons and battlefield doctors develop when they have seen enough to know that panic accomplishes nothing. She was small. She wore her hair in a tight bun. She had a habit of taking off her glasses and cleaning them when she was thinking, which was often. Antonina was captured in the autumn of 1941 during the encirclements that followed the German invasion in the great disasters at Kiev and Vyazma and Bryansk, where entire Soviet armies vanished into German prison columns. She was one of the medical officers who chose to stay with the wounded rather than try to break out. She was one of the ones the Germans found still working when they arrived at the field hospital, still bandaging arms and setting broken legs, still trying to keep men alive who would be dead within a week, regardless of anything she could do. She was taken, she was marched, she was processed, she was sent eventually to a place called Ravensbrück, a women's concentration camp in the forests north of Berlin. And in Ravensbrück, she did what a certain kind of parent does, or under a certain kind of pressure. She started writing things down. She wrote on scraps of paper stolen from the camp infirmary. She wrote on the backs of prescription forms. She wrote on the margins of German requisition slips. She hid what she wrote inside the walls of the barracks, behind loose bricks under floorboards. She wrote for 4 years. She wrote the names of the dead. She wrote the names of the doctors who killed them. She wrote what was done and how and when and by whom. She was still writing when the Red Army arrived at the gates of Ravensbrück on the last day of April, 1945. Everything she wrote would eventually be read aloud in a courtroom in Hamburg, but that is the end of the story. And the story is long, and it is not clean. And there are things in the middle of it that will be difficult to hear. So we begin here, in the snow at Golovkovo, under an apple tree, with a young woman who said nothing, and a village that did not know her name, and a mother in Siberia who would light candles for 16 years for a daughter she had already lost. The Germans thought they had a system for these women. They did not. The women had a system too. It would take the Germans a very long time to understand what it was. The trains ran east to west and west to east across occupied Europe for 4 years, and no one who was not on them knew exactly what they carried. They carried coal. They carried iron ore. They carried Wehrmacht divisions rotating back from the Eastern Front for rest and refit. They carried Jewish families from Warsaw and Krakow and Lodz toward destinations the German railway clerks marked in their ledgers with a single word that meant nothing to anyone who had not been told what it meant. And they carried women, not many compared to the other cargoes, a few dozen here, a few hundred there, Soviet women in the tattered remains of Red Army uniforms, or in whatever the Germans had thrown at them after their uniforms were taken away. They rode in cattle cars with the doors chained shut. They rode for days. They rode without food and often without water. And when the trains stopped in the middle of the night in some rail yard in Poland or East Prussia, they could hear the guards outside laughing at something one of them had said, and they could smell coal smoke and cold iron, and sometimes, from a great distance, something else, something sweet and thick that they did not yet have a name for. The name would come. The trains ran on schedules. That is the thing that a man who has served in an army, who has seen how armies actually work, will understand immediately about what I am about to describe. This was not chaos. This was not the private cruelty of soldiers in the field, though there was plenty of that too. This was a bureaucracy. This was requisition forms and transfer orders and stamped documents in triplicate. This was clerks in warm offices in Berlin deciding which women went to which camp based on categories they had invented and refined over 18 months of careful practice. By the middle of 1942, the German army had refined its category for these women, Flintenweiber, the word I told you earlier. Not a prisoner of war, not a civilian, not a partisan, an anomaly requiring, in the tidy German phrase, special handling. Special handling, Sonderbehandlung. It is a word that appears often in the documents. It always means the same thing. Here is how the machinery worked in practice. A Red Army woman was taken on the battlefield or in a field hospital or during one of the great encirclements where entire Soviet armies collapsed into German hands. If she was wounded and could not walk, she was often shot where she fell. The Wehrmacht did not carry Soviet wounded off the field. It did not have the transport, and it did not have the will. The men who did this were not, most of them, ideological monsters. They were tired soldiers from Bavaria and the Rhineland who had been told these people were not people and who had learned over months of hard fighting to believe it, because believing it was easier than the alternative. If she could walk, she was marched, sometimes hundreds of miles, sometimes in the wrong shoes or in no shoes at all. She was put into a column with other prisoners, and she walked until she reached a transit camp, and along the way, the ones who could not keep up were shot by the roadside and left where they fell. The German documents call this the reduction of the column. It is a phrase you will encounter more than once if you read what these men wrote to each other. At the transit camp, she was sorted. This is the word the Germans used, Sortierung. She was measured, weighed, photographed. Her name was written in a ledger, though often the name recorded was not her name, because the clerks did not care and did not check. She was assigned a number, and then, based on categories no prisoner ever fully understood, she was sent somewhere. Some of them were sent to labor camps in the Reich, to work in factories or on farms. A great many of these women died within months. Malnutrition, exposure, disease, and the particular kind of despair that comes from being sent to work 16 hours a day in a country whose language you do not speak and whose people have been told you are not human. Some of them were sent to the stalags, the regular prisoner of war camps, though this was rare because officially they were not prisoners of war. And some of them, the ones the Germans could not fit into any of the other categories, the ones who were officers or political personnel, or who had been captured with weapons in their hands, and had shown, in the German phrase, unusual firmness of character during interrogation, were sent north. They were sent to a place called Ravensbrück. Ravensbrück was not, in the beginning, a death camp. That must be understood. It was a concentration camp for women, built in 1939 in a pretty stretch of forest 50 miles north of Berlin on the shore of a lake called the Schwedsee. The trees came down to the water. In summer, the water was clear and cold. From the guards' quarters, you could see across the lake to a village with a church whose bells rang on Sundays. The camp held political prisoners at first, German women who had spoken against the regime, communists, Jehovah's Witnesses who had refused to salute the flag. As the war expanded east, the population of the camp changed. Polish women, French women from the resistance, Belgian women, Dutch women, and beginning in 1942, in numbers that grew month by month, Soviet women. By the end of the war, roughly 130,000 women had passed through Ravensbrück. Around 40,000 of them did not come out. The exact figure will never be known because the SS burned most of the records in the last weeks of the war, and the ones that survived are incomplete. What we know for certain is that women were worked to death there, starved to death there, shot there, hanged there, and in the last months of the war, gassed there in a small chamber built next to the crematorium in the final winter of the war. We know these things because a small number of women who were in Ravensbrück wrote down what they saw. One of them was Antonina Nikiforova. She arrived at Ravensbrück in the spring of 1942. She was 35 years old. She had been a physician in Leningrad before the war. She was assigned to the camp infirmary, which the SS called the Revier, and which the prisoners called something else, a word that does not translate well, but that meant, roughly, the place where women went to die. The Revier was not a hospital. It was a sorting station. Women too sick to work were sent there. Women who could not be treated with the almost nothing that the SS provided were left to die on wooden bunks stacked 3 high. Women who were pregnant were sent there, and their pregnancies were ended, and often the women died with them. Women who were selected for what the Germans called experiments were sent there and did not come back. Antonina worked in this place for 3 years. She learned German. She had not known much when she arrived. He learned it by listening to the SS doctors talking to each other in the hallway, by reading the labels on the medicine bottles, by piecing together the meaning of the words on the transfer orders that came through the infirmary. Within a year, she could understand almost everything that was said in front of her, though she was careful never to let this show. A prisoner who understood German was a prisoner who knew too much. Prisoners who knew too much did not last long at Ravensbrück. She began writing things down in the 2nd year. She had no paper at first. She used the backs of prescription forms. She used the margins of German requisition slips that came into the infirmary. She wrote in a tiny, careful script in Russian, in a shorthand of her own invention. She wrote the names of the women who died in the Revier. She wrote the causes of death, the real ones, not the ones the SS doctors put on the forms. She wrote the names of the SS's doctors themselves. She hid what she wrote inside the walls of Barrack 9, behind a loose brick beside the stove, wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth she had stolen from a supply crate. She added to it every few weeks. By the middle of 1943, she had a record of hundreds of deaths. By the end of 1944, she had thousands. She was not the only one writing. There were other women in the camp keeping their own records in French and Polish and Czech and German.
There was an entire underground archive being assembled inside Ravensbrück by women who understood in a way that is difficult to explain to anyone who has not lived under a regime that intends to erase you, that the right itself was a form of resistance.
The Nazis wanted to disappear these women. The women wrote so that they could not be disappeared. It was that simple. It was that hard. I need to tell you now about the experiments. I'm going to tell you as carefully and as briefly as I can, because you did not come here for a catalog of horrors, and because the specific details are documented in medical journals and in the transcripts of the Nuremberg trials and can be read by anyone who wants to read them. What matters here is not the technique, and
what matters is that this happened, and that it was done by physicians, and that the physicians who did it had taken the Hippocratic oath, and that most of them believed, right up until the moment they were sentenced, that they had done nothing wrong.
The experiments at Ravensbrück were run by an SS surgeon named Karl Gebhardt. He was in his mid-40s, tall, professionally distinguished. He was the personal physician of Heinrich Himmler. He was, before the war, a respected orthopedic surgeon who had treated athletes at the Berlin Olympics. He was the kind of man who, at any dinner party in Munich in 1938, would have been considered a credit to his profession. Beginning in the summer of 1942, Gebhardt selected young women from the Polish political prisoners at Ravensbrück for what he called his sulfonamide studies. The stated purpose was medical research. The Wehrmacht was losing men to infected wounds on the Eastern Front, and Gebhardt wanted to prove that certain new drugs were unnecessary. He wanted to prove this because the drugs had been developed by his professional rivals, and Gebhardt was a man who cared about professional rivalries, even in the middle of a world war. He selected 74 young women. Most of them were between 18 and 25. He and his team broke their legs or cut them open and inserted glass, wood, gangrene bacteria, staphylococcus, tetanus. They did this without anesthetic. They did it repeatedly. Some of the women died. Ones who survived were crippled for life. The prisoners in Ravensbrück called them the rabbits because they had been experimented on like rabbits, and because after the surgeries they could only hop from one bunk to another on their good leg. Antonina Nikiforova saw the rabbits. She wrote down their names, all of them. And in the autumn of 1944, when it became clear that the war was ending and that Gebhardt intended to have the survivors, rabbits, killed to remove the evidence of what he had done, Antonina and several other women in the camp underground did something for which there is no adequate word in any language. They hid them. They switched identity numbers with women who had recently died. They changed the tattooed numbers on the rabbits' arms badly with ink and a needle, but well enough. They moved them between barracks. They hid them in the crawl space under Barrack 22. When the SS came to collect the women on Gebhardt's list, the women on the list could not be found, and other women who were already dead, appeared on the roll in their place. It went on for weeks. It required the cooperation of hundreds of prisoners. If any of them had informed, all of them would have been executed. None of them informed. 3 of the rabbits, Antonina Nikiforova, helped to hide, were still alive when the Red Army arrived on the last day of April, 1945. They walked out of Ravensbrück. They went home to Poland. They gave testimony at Nuremberg. One of them lived in 2003. But this is running ahead of the story. I need to bring you back to the winter of 1943 and to a moment that a small group of Red Army women created inside the wire, a moment the SS never forgot and never fully understood. In February of 1943, 536 Soviet women arrived at Ravensbrück and a transport. Most of them were nurses, medical officers, telephone operators, signals personnel, some soldiers. They had been captured at various along the Eastern Front over the previous 18 months and held in transit camps in the east before being consolidated and sent north. At their head, though not by any official designation, was the woman I told you about in part 1. Yevgeniya, 43 years old, teacher of history, native of Odessa, born in Serbia, speaker of 4 languages, including German. She had survived 18 months in the transit camps by making herself useful. She was older than most of the other prisoners. She had a way of speaking, quiet and matter of fact, that made the younger women listen. She had a way of speaking to the guards in their own language that made them listen too. She did not shout. She did not plead. She stated things as if they were already true, and often, by stating them, she made them true. At Ravensbrück, the SS assigned the Soviet women to Barrack 32. They were told they would be working in the Siemens factory adjacent to the camp. The factory made electrical components for the German war effort, fuses, wiring for tanks and aircraft. Yevgeniya listened to the announcement in German and translated it in Russian for the women around her. Then she said, in Russian, quietly, "We are Red Army soldiers. We do not build weapons for the enemy." That was all she said. The next morning, when the SS came to the barrack to march the Soviet women to the factory, the 536 women were standing in formation. Not the shuffling, ragged lines of concentration camp prisoners, military formation, ranks. They had done their hair as neatly as they could. They had adjusted their uniforms, what remained of them, and when the SS officer gave the order to march, they did not move. They sang instead. They sang the Soviet national anthem, and then they sang the Internationale, and when they finished, they stood in silence and looked at the SS officer and waited. He did not know what to do. This is not a matter of Soviet mythology. This is documented in the camp records and in the post-war testimony of survivors on both sides. The SS at Ravensbrück had prepared for many things, but not this. They had prepared for weakness. They had prepared for terror. They had prepared for the slow grinding demoralization that was the camp's usual work. They had not prepared for 536 women in ranks singing an anthem in a language most of the guards did not speak. There were beatings. There were reprisals. 12 of the women were taken to the punishment block. 2 of them died there. The rest of the group was denied food for 3 days. The SS assumed the resistance would collapse. It did not collapse. On the 4th day, the SS made us an offer through a translator. If the Soviet women would work in areas not directly connected to weapons production, they could return to normal camp rations. Cleaning, sewing, laundry. Yevgeniya considered the offer. She spoke to the older women, the officers, the ones who had held rank in the Red Army. Then she went to the German commandant and said in German that this was acceptable. They did not work in the Siemens factory. Not once. Not one of them. In the entire history of Ravensbrück, no other group of prisoners ever forced that concession from the SS. The women of Barrack 32 paid for it in ways that added it up over the following 2 years. They were given the worst work assignments. They were punished collectively for the smallest infractions. Their food rations were cut and cut again. By the end of 1944, many of them were dead of starvation and typhus and simple exhaustion. But they had not built a single fuse for a single German tank. Yevgeniya Clem was still alive at the end. She was thin, her hair had gone gray, her hands shook when she held a cup of water, but she was alive, and she was still in a way that everyone in the camp recognized without bold. Oh, the person the Soviet women looked to when they did not know what to do. She would be one of the women who walked out of Ravensbrück on the last day of April 1945, when the Red Army came through the gates and found what was left of the camp. She would go home to Odessa. And the story of what happened to her after she went home is, in some ways, the hardest part of everything I am going to tell you. But that is part 3. The Red Army came through the gates of Ravensbrück on the morning of April 30th, 1945. It was a Monday. The weather was cold for the last day of April, with a hard wind coming off the lake and a low gray sky that promised rain. The SS had left 3 days earlier. They had marched the prisoners who could still walk westward toward what they hoped would be American lines in a column that came to be called the Death March because so many of the women died on it. Behind them, in the camp itself, they had left the ones too sick or too weak to move. They had left them to die. The Soviet soldiers who came through the wire that morning were young. Most of them had been at war for 3 years. They had seen Kursk, they had seen Warsaw, they had seen the eastern camps at Majdanek and Sobibor. They believed when they entered Ravensbrück that they had already seen everything. They had not. They found roughly 3,000 women still alive inside the camp. The women weighed on average around 70 pounds. Many of them could not stand. Many of them did not understand at first what the uniforms of the soldiers meant, because they had not seen a Red Army uniform in 3 years, and their eyes were not what they had been. One of the soldiers, a boy of 19 from a village outside Smolensk, would later say that he could not remember the faces of any of the women he saw that day, only the eyes, because the eyes were all the same. And they were the eyes of people who had been waiting so long for something that when it finally arrived, they could not quite believe in it. Yevgeniya Clem was among the women found alive in Barrack 32. She was 47 years old. She weighed less than 80 pounds. Her hair had gone completely white. She spoke to the Red Army officer who came into the barrack in Russian, and then in German, and then in Russian again, because in the confusion of that first hour, she was not always sure which language she was speaking. She asked him what date it was. He told her. She nodded and closed her eyes and did not open them for a long time. Of the 536 Soviet women who had arrived at Ravensbrück in February of 1943, roughly 300 were still alive. They had not built a single fuse. Antonina Nikiforova was also alive. She was 38 years old. She had been in the camp for 3 years. She had, when the Soviet soldiers arrived, more than 8,000 names written down on the scraps of paper she had hidden inside the walls of Barrack 9. She retrieved them that afternoon. She put them inside her coat. She did not let them out of her sight for the next 14 months. They would eventually be read aloud in a courtroom in Hamburg. The trials began in December of 1946. The British Ravensbrück had been liberated in what became Soviet zone, but the case files had made their way west with the survivors, and the British had jurisdiction over war crimes committed against Allied nationals. There were 7 trials in all, held in the Curio House in Hamburg between 1946 and 1948. More than a dozen defendants were sentenced to death across those proceedings. Karl Gebhardt was among them. He did not repent. He wrote a letter before his execution in which he described himself as a soldier of medicine and his experiments as necessary work in the service of the German nation. He was hanged at Landsberg prison on the 2nd of June, 1948. He was 50 years old. Dorothea Binz was also hanged. She had been a chief guard at Ravensbrück. She was 27 years old at her execution. Photographs of her from the trial show a small, plain woman with tired eyes. Survivors of the camp who saw her in the dock said she looked in the courtroom exactly the same as she had looked walking the paths between the barracks, with a leather riding crop in her hand. She did not seem to understand, even at the end, that she had done anything unusual. Antonina Nikiforova testified. She read from her papers. She named the doctors. She named the guards. She named the dead. She spoke for hours across multiple days in Russian through a translator. In the quiet, even voice of a woman who had rehearsed this testimony in her head for 3 years while she was still inside the wire. When she was finished, she went home to Leningrad. And here the story turns, and it turns hard, and I need you to stay with me through what comes next, because it is the part of this story that is least often told, and it is the part that matters most. Yevgeniya Klem went home to Odessa in the summer of 1945. She found her apartment occupied by other people. She found her books gone. She found that the school where she had taught history for 18 years had been reorganized, and that the woman who had replaced her did not want to give up the position, and that the school administration was not eager to reinstate a teacher who had spent the war in a German concentration camp. There was a reason for the reluctance. It was the reason that would define the rest of her life and the lives of many thousands of other Soviet men and women who had survived what she had survived. It was called Order Number 2270. Stalin had signed it on the 16th of August, 1941, in the terrible summer of the German invasion, when whole Soviet army were surrendering in the encirclements at Kiev and Minsk and Smolensk. The order was short, and it was clear. Any Soviet soldier who allowed himself to be captured was to be considered a traitor. His family was to lose all state benefits. If he escaped and returned to Soviet lines, he was to be investigated. If the investigation found any reason to doubt his conduct in captivity, he was to be shot or sent to the camps. The order made no distinction between men and women. It made no distinction between soldiers who had surrendered and soldiers who had been wounded and taken. It made no distinction between prisoners of war and concentration camp inmates. All of them, in the eyes of the Soviet state, were suspect. All of them had, by the simple fact of surviving what they had survived, done something that required explaining. Yevgeniya Klem was investigated for 2 years. The interrogations were conducted by officers of the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, in an office building in Odessa. She asked the same questions over and over. Why had she survived when others had died? What had she told the Germans? What had she agreed to do for the Germans in exchange for her life? Who had recruited her? What was the name of her German handler? What was the code phrase she had been given for making contact with foreign intelligence after the war? She had no handler. She had no code phrase. She told them this in her quiet, even voice dozens of times. She told them about the singing in the roll call yard in February of 1943. She told them about the Siemens factory. She told them the names of the women who had stood in ranks with her that morning. She gave the interrogators the addresses of survivors who could confirm every word she said. The interrogators wrote it all down. They did not believe her. They did not entirely disbelieve her either. They were not, most of them, cruel men. They were bureaucrats. They had a job, which was to find enemies of the state, and they had been told that people who had lived through the German camps were, by definition, enemies of the state until they proved otherwise. And Yevgeniya Clem was unable to prove otherwise to their satisfaction, because there was no proof she could offer that would satisfy them. Because what they wanted her to admit was not something she had done. She was not sent to the Gulag. That must be said. Many of the women who had been with her at Ravensbrück were sent to the Gulag, some for 5 years, some for 10, some who did not come out. Yevgeniya Clem was not sent. She was, in the language of the internal NKVD files that would be opened in the 1990s, kept under observation. She was denied her teaching position. She was denied a pension. She was denied the small state benefits that survivors of the war were entitled to. She lived in a single room in a building on the outskirts of Odessa. She took an Essen. Sewing, she tutored the children of families who did not ask too many questions about where she had spent the war. She lived that way for 8 years. In the autumn of 1953, months after Stalin died, Yevgeniya Clem took her own life in Odessa. She left no note. She was 55 years old. The women who had survived Ravensbrück with her when they heard sent letters to the newspapers, to the party, to the veterans' organizations. They asked that she be honored. They asked that the story of what she had done in the camp be told. The letters were filed. Nothing came of them. The Soviet Union in 1953 was not yet ready to hear about Yevgeniya Clem. The Soviet Union in 1953 was not yet ready to hear about any of them. Antonina Nikiforova lived longer. She had made herself in a way that Clem had not managed to make herself, useful to the state. She had testified at Nuremberg. Her records had helped hang German doctors. She was permitted to return to medicine. She worked in Leningrad in a hospital treating tuberculosis patients for the rest of her working life. In 1958, she published a book called Ravensbrück. It was heavily censored. The passages about Order 270, about the NKVD investigations, about what had happened to Yevgeniya Clem, were removed. The passages about the singing in February of 1943 were kept, because those passages were useful to the state, and the state permitted the publication of things that were useful to it. She wrote a second version of the book, uncensored, and hid it. It was published in Russia in 1993, the year she died. She was 86 years old. She had spent the last decade of her life talking to young Russian historians who were coming to her apartment with tape recorders, asking her to say the things she had not been permitted to say for 45 years. She said all of them. She named names. She corrected the record. She talked when she was tired about her friend from the camp, the history teacher from Odessa who had gone home and been broken by the country she had refused to betray. The village of Golovkovo did not forget Vera Voloshina, though it took a long time to remember her name. The journalist Georgy Frolov began asking his questions there in 1957. He found the old woman who had helped cut the body down from the apple tree. He found the peasant who had buried her. He found eventually a photograph in a German archive, and he found the name that went with the photograph. And in 1965, the Soviet Union at last acknowledged that Vera Voloshina, 22 years old, native of Kemerovo, had died at Golovkovo on the 29th of November, 1941, in the service of her country. She was awarded a decoration. A monument was raised in Golovkovo. A school was named after her in Kemerovo. Her mother, who had lit candles for 16 years for her daughter she believed might still be alive, had been dead 6 years by the time the news arrived. In 1994, 3 years after the Soviet Union ceased to exist, the Russian Federation named Vera Voloshina a hero of Russia. She had been dead for 53 years. Zoya Kosmodomayanskaya, her comrade from Reconnaissance Unit 9903, who had died the same day 8 miles away, had been named a hero of the Soviet Union in 1942. Both of them, in the end, got their monuments. I want to leave you with one more thing.
In 1985, a journalist and writer named Svetlana Alexievich published a book in Russian called War Does Not Have a Woman's Face.
It was a collection of interviews with Soviet women who had served in the Red Army during the Second World War. She had spent 7 years finding them, driving to villages in Belarus and Ukraine and Siberia, sitting in kitchens across the former Soviet Union with tape recorders and notebooks, asking women in their 60s and 70s to tell her things they had never told anyone. She had expected them to speak reluctantly. She had expected them to be reserved. Instead, they talked. They talked for hours. They talked until the tape ran out, and she had to change the reel. And then they kept talking. They cried while they talked. They told her things they had never told their husbands or their children. They told her over and over in the same words in different kitchens across a country the size of a continent that no one had ever asked them before. No one had asked them. The book was suppressed for 2 years. It was published in a censored edition in 1988. The uncensored version came out after the Soviet Union fell. It was translated into 30 languages. In 2015, Svetlana Alexievich was given the Nobel Prize in Literature for it and for her other work. In her acceptance speech in Stockholm, she said that she had wanted to write a history of feelings because the history of events had already been written many times. And it had left something out. It had left out the women. It had left out the millions of them on every side of that war who had suffered and endured in the years that followed, been asked to be quiet about what they had suffered and endured because their suffering did not fit the story their countries wanted to tell. Vera Voloshina, 22, of Kemerovo, hanged in an apple orchard for refusing to name her comrades. Yevgeniya, 43, of Odessa, who led 536 women in ranks against the SS and who came home and was broken by the country she had refused to betray and who took her own life in the autumn of 1953. Antonina Nikiforova, 34 of Leningrad,
who wrote down 8,000 names on scraps of paper and carried them out of Ravensbrück inside her coat, and who lived to see the record corrected, and who died in the last year of her life still talking to the young people who had finally come to listen.
3 women, 3 lives, 3 ways of being betrayed. By the enemy who captured them, by the history that forgot them, by the country they had never stopped believing in. They were, in the end, ordinary women. That is the thing you must remember. They were teachers and doctors and students and daughters. They were not built for what was done unto them. No one is. And they endured it anyway. And some of them died, and some of them lived. And the ones who lived carried what they had seen inside them for 40 years, while their country pretended it had not happened. And then, when they were very old, someone finally asked, and they talked, and now you have heard them.